Perfect. So thanks everybody for joining us today. We have Colin Armstrong from Tesco Bank. I'll let him give himself a proper introduction in a minute. Once Colin starts his presentation, we've got a Q&A box down there. If we can keep it separate from the chat box, just so that it's not popping up on the screen all the time. And at the end of the presentation, Colin will be able to answer all your questions. So just feel free to fire them in throughout the process when he's doing it, if you've got them. And then we'll get a chance to chat at the end. Is that all right with you, Colin?
It is, yeah.
Perfect. Right, I'll just leave it up to you. I'll put myself on mute.
Cool. Okay. So hello everyone. I'm Colin Armstrong, so I'm a principal engineer at Tesco Bank, which essentially means I sort of operate across multiple disciplines within the bank and really just try and help out where I can rather than being aligned to one particular thing, which gives me the opportunity to kind of explore some of these additional opportunities that they have at the bank. And our current challenge that I want to talk to you about today is how we are kind of approaching the challenge of continuous deployment in the context of a regulated bank, which for anyone who's worked in that kind of organization will kind of understand what that means. So what I want to talk to you about today, I thought it would be a bit off to kind of just jump in straight into the detail. So I actually think it's quite relevant to kind of explain where Tesco Bank are in their cloud journey, which I think is quite an interesting and actually relatively short tale. You know, we've not been in the cloud for very long. We'll give a bit of history on that, bringing us up to kind of where we are just now, where we stand, and what our current challenges are, why we've decided to really go after continuous deployment at this point in time. And then the two facets to the actual challenge itself. You know, first of all, you know, we're going to talk about how we're going about the technology side of the challenge, but also how we're going about the organizational side of the challenge, and bringing the various disciplines together. And then really, what's our end game? What are we aiming for? Once we've kind of got past the initial hump, you know, not going to say that there is an end game, but you know, what's our current destination? So first of all, a bit of history. So when Tesco Bank first started looking at the cloud, it was approximately 5 years ago, and it really did stand up as a very, very much a trial. And that question, you know, what is the cloud? Let's experiment with this new way of computing. And it's safe to say it wasn't a glaring success. What it first looked like, I'll let the picture sort of depict. That was my best Google of herding cats. So we made all the classic mistakes. We, you know, didn't have the correct controls around the environment. You know, we didn't have standards, monitoring, you know, compliance, ways of working, a standard set of tooling, all of these things. You know, you would essentially look at it and think that it was a proof of concept that had gone a bit too far. And thankfully, we realized that very quickly and halted at that point and moved on. So having gone and dipped our toe in the water and essentially been a little bit burnt, but not too badly, fortunately, we thought, okay, you know, there was definitely elements of this cloud that we liked, and we're going to regroup and we're going to try again, and we're going to go after it in a far more robust fashion this time. So we did so. We went through a few steps. So first of all, we bedded in our tool sets, you know, rather than kind of letting tools just fly, a very open source, very not uncontrolled is the wrong word, but unstandardized maybe is a better word. We industrialized a set of critical tools, you know, so we've taken Jenkins, we've got an enterprise Jenkins in-house setup, Nexus, Terraform, you know, we chose Ansible as our tool of choice. And we've got an enterprise GitHub as well, which I've forgotten to put the logo on. And they are, you know, industrialized, standardized, and supported bank-wide. You know, so we all use a unified tool set. We've got our teams are scaled up. You know, we've invested heavily in our people to make sure that they've got AWS certification. You know, I've put the Python logo on there, but there's too many technologies to list all the logos in one box. We've trained people in all of the arts of how to deploy and run in a cloud environment. And then on the platform itself, we have implemented controls. There are controls in place to prevent you from going outside of standards, to prevent you from introducing security risks to the estate, various other bits and pieces that you would expect from someone who operated in a cloud environment. So what that kind of all adds up to is now we're at the point where we can start to think about taking that next step, and to really going from a company who has some computers in the cloud and has some systems in the cloud to really leveraging what the cloud's all about. And our chosen cloud is Amazon at the moment. So here we are. We've got to that point, but we do have some problems. So we do have, a large amount of our systems that have been put in place. I would want to say, but in a rush. They've been put in maybe by teams of contractors that have since left the organisation. So there's knowledge gaps. As I said, our approach has been quite quick. We've been quite rapid into the cloud. Those last few slides have covered sort of the last 4 years or so, which in a regulated industries is not a very long period at all. It's quite amazing that we've come as far as we have in such a short time. But there are inconsistencies in our individual builds. Those inconsistencies in turn lead to instabilities, because we've got just bugs that have never quite managed to be retrofitted throughout the route to live. Some of the builds have kind of diverged and been, manually poked. It's all the usual things that you would expect to see occur that cause problems in environments. Testing is an interesting one. So testing, in terms of automated testing, is a developing discipline still within Tesco Bank. There are automated tests in place, but what I'm kind of meaning here is they're not integrated, so that when I press a button and I build my cloud infrastructure and deploy my applications, they're not immediately tested as part of that same pipeline. So testing is integrated to the building of a jar file or WAR file, but not into the deployment process that actually would potentially put that live in front of a customer. And the culmination of all of these things is teams are having to react quickly to potentially new bugs. We're going to have to go back through their sort of technology debt, and a reaction time for the business who are fundamentally there to support isn't quite where it needs to be. So those are the problems we're facing just now. So with all that information behind us, we are, ready to do something different and take the next step. There's enough of the pieces in place that we can fix this and we can move on. So what we've done at this point is we've decided to really go after the automation at the infrastructure and deployment and service running level, rather than sort of doing it off in little pieces just in development environments. We're going to automate right through the route to live. And we've coined the phrase Atlas, which, like all good systems, we came up with the name and then shoehorned an acronym into it. So I'm not even going to tell you what it is, actually, because I can't quite remember. But Atlas is our continuous deployment platform that we've set out to deliver, so that service teams can use it to deploy their applications into the cloud. And we set out with some simple but difficult aims. So we want to make it the simplest way to deploy applications into the Tesco Bank public and private cloud environments. So it does have to be platform agnostic, although right now we only have to cater for AWS. We want to make sure we're compliant by default. As I keep coming back to, we are a regulated bank, but we want to make sure that compliance isn't something that each individual team has to think about. It's the platform that can deliver that by virtue of how we code it. And that is quite a big thing for teams to not have to worry about that anymore. That's a significant step forward for them. Automated by default. What I mean by that is we want to make sure that we discourage manual interventions into the deployment process. And I do say discourage because we don't want someone to be excluded if there was a technical limitation, but we want to make sure that the default action here is to be automated and evergreen. So any changes to our deployment platform are immediately available to all. Any changes, to the underlying artifacts, let's say, we've got a Node application, Node automatically upgrades, Java automatically upgrades, our operating system is automatically patched by virtue of using the Atlas platform. That's what we're going for. We want to take all that heavy lifting away from teams to let them start to do more interesting work, fundamentally. So I want to get into it a little bit because I know there's people on the call that will be thinking, all those words are great, and I'm one of them. All those words are great, but let me see what it actually looks like. So what we've done here, this is actually slightly pre-Atlas. One of our bright senior engineers, Fokyon, he has sort of recognized that there is a lot of repetition in the environment, and he started off this concept of setting up project settings just in a JSON manifest file. And what we do here is we define projects in a JSON manifest file, some specific project-specific settings, things like project codes for tracking finance, little bits and pieces for naming, data that we need to uniquely tag the instances, and other things like that. And our initial foray into this was actually just to set it up as an orchestrator. So this is where we see here Ansible repo branch and Ansible repo URL, and the same for Terraform. It's fundamentally sort of saying we could have the capability of reusing code here, but right now what I want to do is just have this orchestrate together my Terraform repository and my Ansible repository together, and build out my application. And that was quite successful, but it wasn't necessarily as scalable as we wanted it to be. So we've wrapped a few more people around this to help Fokyon out and moved it on slightly. And what we've done is we've said, actually, here, what we want to do is we want to provide that kind of shopping cart of infrastructure capabilities to developers. So if a developer comes along and they've got their Node application, they say that it would be great if I could just deploy this into blue-green. These 5 lines of code here, 6 lines of code here is all they actually need to implement a blue-green deployment, which has a load balancer and 2 sets of servers, and all the functionality needed to actually release change to that environment. It's all wrapped up just in those few lines of code. So from a usability perspective, that's what we mean by this is the easiest way to deploy your applications into the cloud. There's a number of other capabilities that not necessarily showed you the best example by putting an IAM role in there, but if you want a Redis cluster, if you want an Oracle database, they're all similarly defined, which makes it very easy for someone who's not necessarily got the skill set to deploy those things, to consume them. Like I said, we keep those modules up to date with all the relevant standards. So great, we've got our servers, and they're behind a load balancer, but what about what's on the servers? So we've applied the exact same methodology here as well and said, you don't need to know anything about how to install and configure nodes to Tesco Bank standards. We've wrapped that up. All you need to do is say that you want a node application. These variables are actually substituted in, but fundamentally, there's the name of the service that I'm going to deploy, what version it is, and where it is in our strategic artifact repository. And those few lines of code there will then go and make sure that that is deployed onto an Amazon machine image and configured appropriately. Going forward, we'll make sure it's monitored and secured appropriately as well. So again, you don't have to know how that works. And there's other types of capability. If we, for example, need an Oracle client file, a JVM, a Spring Boot setup, we'll wrap all these up in nice, easy to consume units. just going to fire across and have a quick read of the questions there. I'm going to come back to those if you don't mind. And the last challenge we've got here, when deploying these things to the cloud is obviously doing all the networking. So we've applied a networking block at the end. I don't need to read down this. Hopefully, we've tried to make it quite easy to read. This is, a connection from my users to my applications, blue-green deployment, from my Bastion server to my blue-green deployments, auto-scaling groups on port 22, so that we can SSH in and do diagnostics, etc., etc. All nice and easy to define. And again, because this is a JSON file, we can actually abstract it one level further and put a UI across the top of it, which is something we plan on doing in future to make a usability improvement. So I'm going to fire across to one of the questions here about what sort of services am I using for running app code? Am I spinning up EC2 instances, Lambda, Elastic Beanstalk, etc.? So it's a good question because, anyone who knows the platform would understand that like Elastic Beanstalk, for example, might do some of these features for us and make life a lot easier for us. I hate to rule out the same thing again. Part of our commitment to regulators, as having a banking license, is that we need to be able to shift between cloud environments. So the only sort of applicable thing we could do to kind of abstract away the actual underlying platform here would be to use something like containerization, which is something that's almost next up on our roadmap. But we couldn't tie ourselves in too much using things like Elastic Beanstalk and Lambda, because it would be too difficult for us to be able to prove that we could exit one cloud supplier and move to another. And that's why we're having to home grow some of this stuff. I hope that answers that question. So fundamentally, under the covers here, it's auto-scaling groups, EC2 instances, load balancers. It's the raw components rather than consumable services, with the exception of databases. We do use Amazon's RDS for managing databases, just because it makes life so much easier. It was worthwhile. Another question we've got there is, what kind of challenges have we got with PCI DSS compliance? This doesn't really touch on that. If you mean as a bank in general, it's down to the individual service areas, how they handle that type of thing. And that's more a challenge it's left of this, so to speak. We have built-in security scanning software and things like that as part of the code deployment pipeline. So actually, I'm going to make a wild assumption there because I'm not totally sure, but I would hope that sort of stuff would be caught before we're actually deploying these things into the cloud environments. Cool. So I'm going to move on. Just want to sort of show, based on that manifest, how it kind of changes our approach to deploying into the cloud. So if we imagine that all these repositories are essentially, for ease of explanation, they're all individual node applications. And what happens is, as an organization in the past, we kind of end up with this situation where a new node application is required, and our engineers go and they find the nearest similar node application, copy the repository, change some properties, maybe add a couple of features, and then deploy that application. And that sort of cycle has carried on and on and on. And as features get added, because we've got an additional security requirement or a cool service protection feature, things like that, into the node setup, not necessarily been retrofitted back up through all the other node applications, which is where the underlying inconsistency and instability that I talked about earlier really kind of stems from an infrastructure build perspective. And kind of we end up with like the world's worst Git forking history, which I'm sure people are familiar with and try and avoid like the plague. So using this approach here, those the engine behind the JSON files that I showed you in the last few slides is really the dark blue section here, which takes all those manifests, makes sure that the capabilities are all there, always with all the features, all with all the mandatory capabilities, our security, event monitoring requirements, encryption, server security, intrusion protection, plus our monitoring, log shipping, automatic recovery, failover. All these capabilities are always just there right from the outset. All the individual service teams or developers need to do is produce that manifest and make sure that the values in it, map to a project, and they get all of the rest of it out of the box, which is going to make quite a big step shift in the supportability of all our components. Add into that the fact that some of these features are focused solely into automated deployments, verifications, checkouts, smoke tests of the applications, means that we can use this as well, so that all you need to do as well is provide a test. Once that automated test's in place, we can actually push forward through a route to live environment and get features in front of customers faster, which is basically why we're here as an IT function. So that was the technology side of things. We want to cover off. It's not just been I'd like to describe that one as the bottom up, where some technologists start looking at a certain, methodology and start to try and push it up the way towards project managers, delivery managers, and environment managers. But actually, our senior leadership right up to the director level have recognized, a shift in the marketplace and the efficiencies that brings behind changing from what we call a kind of functional layered support model into a product aligned support model. So on the left here, I've got just some bullet points on how organizations, you may recognize this type of setup, how organizations used to work, where you've got developers or application maintainers cutting code, handing off to someone else to deploy it, handing off to someone else to look after the operating system, handing off to someone else to look after, the hypervisors. More into this setup on the right-hand side here, where you've got a group of people, cross-disciplined, who are responsible as a group, have that accountability to make sure that that part of the banking service is always there and always good and always up to date and always able to deliver the next feature to support the business, which is our product alignment. Our leadership focus has changed as well. So instead of just being focused on the next project, which, as anyone who's been in that type of organization will understand, means that you get a tech debt build-up because we've not maintained and secured and patched the platform and kept ourselves current. We're actually service-led now. So all of those facets of engineering and service management are wrapped in together alongside feature delivery, to make sure that the platform is always maintained to a high standard and the features are delivered, which is a difficult thing to do. And the skill set, the skills profile of not just our engineers, but actually, bleeding out into the project management community and the environment management community as well. Skills have changed as we need to understand more disciplines. You will have your specialism, but you will also understand, the surrounding disciplines as well. So one of the major problems one of the major things that we want to make sure we do as we kind of go through this journey towards continuous delivery, in historically, we've kind of built ourselves a bit of a trust challenge, because as I said, we had some limited skill sets that put the initial automation in place. They were part of a temporary workforce, so things have gone, there's a bit of instability in there. And what it's done is it's meant that the sort of term automation has not become synonymous with the solution as we would like it to be. It's actually seen as a little bit of a risk and a little bit of a problem, which isn't really where we want it to be. So this is our experimentation phase, as we start to sort of prove that actually we can make automation work really well, and we're going to prove it. We're going to go after it to the point that you cannot dispute that this is the best way of doing things. We are picking our easiest payloads to begin with, just to make sure that we're not focused too much on the difficult complexity of an individual payload, but actually on the deployment process itself. And we're going to make sure we put a lot of measurements around this experimentation phase so that we can show people, both technical and non-technical community, how we're doing things better through automation. Then we'll move up into the nurture phase, where we make the automation much more serious. We actually make sure that we bed in that process of getting the tests integrated. We've got people behind it. We've got an engineering community both supporting their own applications but also feeding into the underlying platform, and measuring further and trying to push out data that shows how we improve that value stream from a requirement to get into production, and all the other requirements that we have on managing the platform. Going forward, we'll look to expand it. We'll take care of the more difficult platforms. So those platforms that have previously been sort of difficult to manage will have the bandwidth, will have the additional engineering space and headspace and experience to actually bring it into the platform and make sure it works. And to be honest, going forwards into that business partnership stage, we want it to be recognized right outside of the IT function, that it's actually making the business's life easier. They don't have to, be concerned about which features they want to pick and choose. We can deliver them all for them because we'll be so much faster, safer and reliable and predictable. That's really where we're going. That's what we want to be doing. And where does it leave us? The last slide, I want to get to that point where automation is now regarded as a solution. It's a shock when the automation goes wrong and we're focused on fixing it if and when it does. And that concept of it being a risk is dwindled away. We increase our speed, we increase our capacity to deliver change. Just, by virtue of using a unified platform. On the unification of the platform comes an alignment of the technology stack. So now everyone will be using the same things. There'll be a lot of more encouragement to use existing capabilities. We won't have that spread of IT that you sometimes see in an organization that's not aligned in this way. As a result of all of that stuff, we can increase experimentation both in the IT function itself, but actually, as sort of slightly alluded to earlier, we can encourage the business to start thinking more experimentally, because it's not such a big risk to them to ask the IT function to deliver something. There can be far more throwaway experiments, and the more experimentation there is, the more chances we have of finding things that add value to the business and to our customer base. And I'm going to put, we want to see it as well. We want to see that when a developer, presses to commit their code and it lands in our Nexus repository, that it got to production 4 hours later, and then 3 months later, 2 months later, that time's reduced to 2 hours and then 1 hour. And then, the guys are able to do, 15 deployments a day to the same application. And it's very easy to make updates. We want to see that, and we want to sort of feel that speed and velocity come through. So that is where we're going with it. So another question there as well. Did we consider building a private cloud, or was the aim always to use public cloud? Yes. Public cloud was there, if you see what I mean. We didn't have to build it, so it's the obvious choice for us. Our data center that we're migrating out of is kind of it's in a strange position. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of it, but it's got some legacy kit in it, and rather than go through the rigmarole of trying to uplift that in place, we've gone to the public cloud. But we will also build a private cloud, and that's what I mentioned earlier about underlying this platform. We have Terraform in place, so we'll be able to abstract away and deploy, for example, a blue-green deployment, but into the private cloud in our data center, and that will just become another option within the manifest. And that actually brings me to the end of my presentation. So hopefully it was useful for you, but I will kind of open up to questions at that point.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Colin. I'm going to let the guys ask some more questions just now. In the Q&A, whilst we've got you, obviously answered some throughout, which is brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Has anyone got anything else for Colin?
Let me know if I didn't answer your question as well. Happy to elaborate. Nope. Any restrictions on what we can use? We will have regional restrictions, probably related to GDPR. I wouldn't have details of that to hand. Fundamentally, we're UK based in the regions that we've chosen because our customer base is primarily UK based, so it makes sense to have it there. Do we track our lead time for changes in deployment frequencies? Some teams do, and we want to build on that a lot more. It's kind of tracked not necessarily on a team by team basis at the moment. It's more just an ongoing change cycle into a production environment. But yeah, tracking lead time changes and a deployment cadence is something teams are starting to do, to be fair, but we want to do more. And then measure that and feed it back in for improvement reasons as well. It was quite hard to follow which questions are popping up new, which ones are.
Stephen's just asked another question there about CI.
Never worked with true continuous integration. If something ends up in prod and breaks it, how do you fix it? Can I roll back, or is it fix and fail forward? Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's precisely where we are at the moment in our thinking. So continuous integration to me is more the process of getting those deployable artifacts through sort of the unit test setup and into a repository. So kind of looking at the continuous deployment here to get those out into production. So we've factored in, especially in the blue-green capability, we sort of factored in the concept of putting tests throughout the deployment lifecycle. So, as we switch from blue to green, for example, we check that those instances are in the load balancer, and we'll in future put an actual smoke test in against that dormant environment before switching traffic onto it. So we're going to try as hard as we possibly can to make sure that we don't actually push those things into production. And the fix, would either be because an automated test has failed, it would actually roll it back at that point, or it would have to be a case of pushing, a new fixed artifact through the route to live, and that's something that we do now, but we do it manually. So if an artifact does go live into production and there's a fix, it will either be backed out, or if it's a minor fix that we can live with for a couple of days, then a new, a break fix will be put in and rolled through the route to live fast. I think, what engine are we using to process the JSON files? Is it homegrown Terraform setup? Kind of. So the JSON files are processed by Atlas, which is essentially a shared library that we run within Jenkins. So the parts that deal with Terraform go off and wrap up Terraform modules and deal with the inputs to those Terraform modules and apply some intelligence, parsing plan files and things like that, so that we know what state the environment's in, what state we plan for it to be in, if we're happy with that, or if we need to make updates to the properties. And then finally, there's a final check before the last apply is done, just to make sure that we're not going to, or at least we don't think we're going to break anything. We can apply some intelligence into the pipeline at that step. For the on-host capabilities, it's kind of wrapping up Packer in the same way. So the engine's fundamentally the Atlas platform that we're developing, and it wraps up a number of these technologies, pulls in, Ansible playbook repositories and runs them as part of the Packer setup, places files on the servers and in locations so that they'll run at startup and things like that. We've made it quite flexible. So hopefully that answers that question. It's weird in this call, there's no feedback. I saw another one pop up. I'm going to see it. Okay, got distracted. Oh, there we go. How do you handle breaking database changes during the deployment? Is a good question. So I'm gonna definitely caveat with, this is what we are working on now, rather than this is the solution that we have in place. This is something that we're working on now. So actually Foki, on the instigator of the platform, is working on exactly that. And it's not going to be a challenge that's easy to solve, and it's not going to be a wholly challenge that only the platform itself can solve, because that tends to come down to writing the application so that it either upgrades the database as it goes, or it's backwards compatible, and that's how the scripts run. So a lot of that one is kind of dealt with already quite a lot. We've got quite a lot of experience in rolling updates into databases. Where possible, we do it that way. We'll write scripts that detect where a database schema is, in its release life cycle, and only apply the updates to it that need to be applied. If the worst comes to the worst, then we have to go through the process of kind of taking a snapshot of the database and potentially rolling back to it, which isn't where we want to be. So we do try and avoid that as much as possible. There's another one there. Sorry.
Is there another one there for you, Colin?
Yeah, I got another one from Alexander. Could you tell me more about prod change authorization and automation in it? Requirement for teams to authorize deployments of prod approvals, etc. Yeah, great question. So we do have a change management process as part of, it's kind of being an ITIL organization. We are starting to develop the hooks into ServiceNow. So I'm kind of hoping, I was initially hopeful that we would be able to go in over the ServiceNow API and raise informational changes as we go through the route to live. However, I think to start with, what we'll have to do is basically rely on people, having raised changes for the relevant environment that we can then check. We can just check that they exist as the deployment process proceeds. But the authorization, really, we want to come from the automated tests to say, if the tests pass, we're good to go. Questions are flying in there. I'm probably getting these massively out of order, by the way, because I think it's ordering on how many thumbs are on it. So thinking of redundancy, how many instances of an app would you typically run? Would it be across several AZs, several regions, US East, one caught a few people out recently? Yeah, yep, we've experienced AZ outages, and in fact, I think one region outage in the last few years, which hasn't been massively fun. And we do deploy currently inside a region. So we just go across multiple availability zones instead of going cross region. Although I expect cross region and potentially cross cloud might be on the horizon. It'll be something we'll have to deal with. To have to if I click answer live, does that mark them as answered? Does it?
What was that? Sorry.
If I click answer live, complete done, puts them in the answered column, and I can see what I'm
What's
doing.
left?
Yeah.
I think that's us.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Colin. That was really good, and clearly by the engagement from the attendees, that they also thought so as well. So this was recorded, so if Colin's happy to do so, then we can share the slides on the meetup page and post the video on YouTube for you to watch back. And Colin, would you be happy for anyone to reach out to you directly via LinkedIn or whatever it may be for any follow-up questions?
Yeah, absolutely. No problem.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining. Colin, thanks very much for your time. Really enjoyed that. And as I say, we will get everything all set up on YouTube and be able to get people to watch it for anybody that missed it as well. Because I know there's a few people that just couldn't make it at the last minute that were keen to hear you speak.
No worries. All right.
All righty. Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.